Welcome everybody to another edition of Fitness Facts. On this episode, I'm discussing resistance training guidelines to optimize muscle protein synthesis and muscle growth, also known as hypertrophy. So the overview, where are we going in this discussion? We're going to talk about the number of sets that are recommended to optimize muscle protein synthesis and growth, the number of reps per set, the load that should be used, so the weight. What about training to failure? Rest period lengths between sets. The exercises you should select and the order you should perform them in a resistance training exercise bout. Training frequency, how many times a week should you train? And other important points too, and that's a old photo there of me with the 4-time Mr. Olympia bodybuilding champion Jay Cutler when I lived down in Las Vegas. I was teaching at a career college, basically training personal trainers, teaching a variety of courses, anatomy, physiology, exercise prescription, nutrition. I'm trying to remember what else I taught. But anyway, we used to have Jay come in every once in a while and talk to the students. He'd talk about his diet and his training. And I remember that that year, that's in 2006, that was like right before he won his first Mr. Olympia. He told me he was eating about 6,000 calories a day. But again, Jay was 5'11", I don't know, maybe 285 pounds there. And so to support that much muscle tissue, he needed to eat 6,000 calories a day. Most people, if they're eating that much, they would balloon up and be extremely overweight and obese. But when your body is comprised of that much muscle, you've got to eat that many calories to support that tissue. So anyway, and I think I remember Jay telling me he, because he's eating a lot of protein, obviously, but I think he had a refrigerator, if I remember correctly, out in his garage where it was just full of eggs if he needed a quick source of protein. And it was an astronomical amount of money that he was spending on groceries each year, even back in 2006 when I first met him. So anyway, just some fun facts there. Jay, if you watch this, sorry for talking about you, or maybe you don't care. Anyway. So number of sets, let's talk about this first, to optimize muscle growth, muscle protein synthesis. So there appears to be, there is a dose-response relationship between the volume that you do in a workout or in a week, which volume is the total number of sets and reps in a training session, or if you look at a whole week. So there's a relationship between the volume and the amount of muscle that you grow. So higher training volumes, more sets, more reps, tend to lead to greater muscle mass gains. That makes sense intuitively. Multiple sets per exercise and per muscle group tend to increase muscle protein synthesis more than just doing a single set of a given exercise, one set per muscle group. You're not going to get the same muscle growth as doing multiple sets and multiple exercises per muscle. It looks like between 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week is a good general recommendation for optimizing muscle hypertrophy. Now, more advanced lifters, they may need greater weekly volumes, anywhere from 21 to 35 sets per muscle group per week to maximize muscle protein accretion and growth. Now, I wouldn't recommend trying to do 30, 35 sets of just, say, chest in one workout, right? You're going to need to spread that volume across the week. So maybe you do, if you're aiming for 30 total sets of a particular muscle group like chest in a week, you do 15 on Monday and then another 15, say, on Thursday or Friday. You want, typically 48 to 72 hours rest between sessions before training the same muscle group again. So I talked to a guy at the gym several weeks ago that I was asking about his training frequency and how many sets he was doing in a workout. And he told me he was going to do 36 sets of chest alone that day. And I was like, oh my gosh, spread that volume out across the week, okay? Maybe do half that today and the other half later in the week, right? Now, lagging muscle groups, they may need higher volumes per week. So maybe you have an area, like I have crappy calves, they're kind of small compared to some of my other muscles. I could probably train those with greater volume. They're a muscle group that's kind of lagging behind, right? So may need to do higher volume training for those stubborn muscle groups that you just can't seem to grow, okay? Avoid overtraining by progressively increasing volume over the training cycle, so slowly and progressively increasing your sets, your reps. If you start out, you're not going to want to be doing 30 sets in a single workout, right? So maybe you start at 10 and then you slowly progress the sets and reps over time, right? Every once in a while, I think it is important to reduce training volume, maybe for a week, cut the volume down a little bit so that you don't overtrain. That's going to help facilitate recovery from your workouts too. So the number of reps per set and the load you should use. So let's talk about that. So resistance training across a wide spectrum of repetition ranges per set is recommended to ensure complete development of each muscle group. So there's some pretty broad guidelines here. So anywhere from 1 to even greater than 20 reps per set could be utilized. Loads that allow a medium repetition range, say of 6 to 12 repetitions, allow for efficient training each set. And when I say 6 to 12 repetitions, I'm saying use a load where you're going to fail or not be able to really do maybe but 1 or 2 more reps. So your target is to hit 6 reps of squats. And you're using a load when you hit that 6th rep, you're fatigued, you can't do any more, or maybe you could do 1 or 2 more reps, right? So a rep range using loads where you can do 6 to 12 reps per set, that's a good effective kind of general guideline for muscle hypertrophy and stimulating muscle growth. Devote specific sessions or training cycles to lower and higher repetition training. So for instance, maybe earlier in the week, say on Monday and Tuesday, you train with heavier loads, right? So maybe you train with heavy loads where you can only do, say, 3 reps per set or 5 reps per set, right? Because as you increase the load, the number of reps you're going to be able to complete is going to drop. So maybe earlier in the week, you use heavier loads each set and lower reps. And then later in the week, you use lighter loads and you do more repetitions per set. So this variation just kind of helps with recovery, preventing overtraining, preventing stagnation in your program. Also, another way that you can kind of cycle your training sessions is maybe you do 3 weeks of moderate to heavy load training, and then the last week of the month, you cut the load back, you drop the load down, you don't lift as heavy, and you do more repetitions per set, okay? So those are just some examples to think about. Now, although a wide range of loads and repetitions can be used to induce muscle hypertrophy, if you really want to optimize or maximize muscle strength, you've got to do some heavy load training, okay? So this is using loads where you can only get, 5 repetitions per set down to just 1, like maxing out. So that 1 to 5 repetition maximum range. However, don't always train heavy. You don't want to be going heavy every single workout because that can overstress your joints, overtax your neuromuscular and your hormonal, your endocrine system, right? Do not train with loads that are lower than 70% of your 1 repetition max if you're trying to optimize muscle strength. So again, just for numbers' sake, let's say maybe you're a novice, high school, you can only bench 100 pounds. That's your 1 repetition max. 70% of that would be 70 pounds. So really, if you're wanting to optimize muscle strength, you're going to want to train with loads that are no less than 70 pounds. So somewhere between 70 and 100 pounds to really optimize your muscle strength. Now, if you're just looking to have some gains in muscle mass and hypertrophy, you can use lighter loads. So loads 50%, 60% of your 1 repetition max. However, it is known that loads less than 30% of your 1 repetition max, those loads are too light. They elicit suboptimal muscle growth compared with loads that are above that, okay? So there is a minimum threshold for hypertrophy to occur. You need to at least be lifting a load that's greater than 30% of your 1 rep max on that given exercise. Most training sets should be completed. When we talk about training to failure, you can train to failure sometime, meaning complete muscular fatigue. So let's say you're going to do a set of 10 curls, and you get to 10 and you're like, oh, I can't do any more. Okay, you've trained to failure. You can do that occasionally. You don't want to do that all the time because that could lead to some overtraining. But generally, if you complete a set with 1 or 2 reps in reserve, so that's near failure. That's going to be adequate and provide a near maximal stimulus to the muscle without much of the associated fatigue seen with training to complete failure. If sets are not taken close to failure, let's say you leave like 5 reps in the tank, well, then the muscle protein synthesis response is going to be smaller than it would be if you trained closer to failure, right? So if your goal is maximizing hypertrophy and growth, you want to, not leave too many reps in reserve, right? In untrained subjects, training close to failure appears to produce similar muscle mass gains as training to complete failure, okay? Now, training to complete muscular failure can be implemented selectively. For example, reserve training to failure for the last set of each exercise in a single workout session, or for a single exercise. Like maybe you're doing deadlifts and you're going to do 4 sets. Let's just say 4 sets of 8 is your target. That last set, you can go to complete failure, right? But the other sets, you maybe use a load where when you hit the 8th rep, you know that you're capable of doing maybe 1 or 2 more. That's the reps in reserve, but you go ahead and stop anyway, okay? So frequent high volume training with each set taken to failure can actually result in overtraining, eventually forcing reduced training volume or intensity for recovery. So this is why you don't want to every set, every workout, every week, just constantly always go to failure so that you don't start to become overtrained, and then that causes your recovery to be inadequate, may start affecting your muscle strength, your muscle mass, and your program. You may plateau. You just don't see improvement if you start overtraining. Or you may regress, which is even worse, right? So you may start going backwards, getting weaker, losing muscle. That's not good, okay? So let's look at this study here by Dr. Michael Stone, big name in the field. If you ever come across any studies of his, I recommend reading them. So we looked at back in '96. This was published in the Strength and Conditioning Journal. Training to muscular failure, is it necessary? Here's the summary from that study by Dr. Stone. Currently, there is little evidence that training to failure will enhance strength, power, or muscle hypertrophy. Constant training to failure over a relatively long period, for example, greater than 7 weeks, may be counterproductive to one's attempts to increase strength, power, or hypertrophy. Until there is more research substantiating the benefits, constant training to failure is not advisable. Let's look at rest period lengths between sets. What's optimal so that you can achieve, that optimal level of hypertrophy and growth? Well, typically greater than or equal to 2 to 3 minutes rest between sets for multi-joint exercises. These are exercises where you're working more muscle mass at once, so things like squats, deadlifts, shoulder presses, bench press, lat pull downs, pull-ups, right? Multiple joints are being moved at once, and you're working more muscle mass at once. So generally, it takes a longer duration between sets to be fully recovered, to regenerate phosphocreatine and your energy stores between sets. For single joint exercises, like say a tricep extension or a bicep curl or calf raises, leg extensions, hamstring curls, you're working a smaller amount of muscle, just a single joint move in there. Shorter rest periods can be used. Shorter rest periods are going to allow for adequate recovery, like 60 to 90 seconds when you're doing those single joint exercises. Anytime you're using heavier loads, like say a load you could only lift 3 times or 4 or 5 times, those are heavy loads. You're going to need longer rest periods, greater than 3 minutes, maybe even up to 5 or 6 minutes between sets, again, to allow time to fully recover. Because anytime you're lifting heavy loads, you have to recruit a lot of muscle tissue, a lot of muscle fibers, and it's an extreme effort to lift those heavy loads. So you need that longer rest period. Someone who's new to resistance training may also require longer rest periods between sets than someone who is well-trained. A well-trained individual that's been doing resistance training for months or years, they're going to be adapted to it, and they can generally don't need to rest as long between sets. So here, the title of this study from 2016 by Brad Schoenfeld and colleagues was published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, titled Longer Interset Rest Periods Enhance Muscle Strength and Hypertrophy in Resistance-Trained Men. The conclusion of this study was that a longer rest period, 3 minutes, between sets actually promotes greater increases in muscle strength and size compared to shorter rest periods where Subjects only rested a minute. Exercise selection and order. So here, a wide variety of exercises should be used over the course of a periodized training program to maximize whole body muscle hypertrophy. So it's important to train muscles based on their anatomic design. This is where, like in my kinesiology class, I talk to the students and I say, look, if you can learn where muscles attach, the bones they attach to, and the bones they move, and what their function is and the movements they create, then all you got to do to train them is apply a load to them, right? And they're going to get bigger and stronger if the program is designed correctly, the training program, right? So if you know how the muscle functions, then you just know that you've got to apply a load to it that's working against its natural movement pattern. So it's important here to use a combination of free weights, cables, machines, a variety of different training devices. Also include both multi-joint and single-joint exercises in your program to maximize muscle growth. I think it's important to perform the multi-joint exercises first and early on in your workout session prior to doing single-joint exercises. So for example, it's smart to do bench press or shoulder presses before you would do, say, a tricep extension, which is a single-joint exercise, right? If you do tricep extensions first, obviously that's targeting the tricep muscle. That muscle is going to become fatigued, and that's going to make it more difficult to do your multi-joint exercise, like the bench press, because the tricep assists the chest muscles, pectoralis major, when you're bench pressing, right? So usually work big to small, multi-joint to single joint. There's a hypertrophic benefit for muscles worked first in a training session. So this is another important factor to think about. If you have some muscle groups that are smaller, kind of lagging behind, they're underdeveloped compared to other muscles you have, you might want to train those underdeveloped muscle groups first in the session, and then the other more well-developed muscles later. So training frequency. When moderate to higher training volumes are performed, for example, greater than 10 sets per muscle per week, higher training frequencies, training that muscle group, each muscle group at least twice per week, is going to allow for better volume management and greater muscle growth and adaptations over time. So when you're doing a higher volume of training for each muscle group each week, you need to spread that volume out across the week. So this is where it's important to start utilizing split routines so that you can train each muscle group twice per week. So for instance, an example of a common split routine here where you're training 6 days a week and resting one, you see there on Thursday, is to do what's called a push-pull legs routine. So on day one, on Monday, all the muscles in the upper body involved in pushing, the chest, the shoulders, and the tricep, which extends the elbow, those are going to be trained on Monday. All right, so Tuesday, you're going to do a pull routine. So back, biceps, those muscles are involved in pulling, right? Bicep, flexing the elbow, back, extending the arms and adducting them towards the side. Also throwing abs that day. And then on Wednesday, it's going to be a leg day, right? So for these different muscle groups, you know, maybe you're doing 10 to 12 sets of chest on Monday, 10 sets of shoulders, 10 sets of tries. You're doing high volume, but you're not trying to do, you know, like 30 sets of just chest on that day, right? So you'd come back on Friday, do chest, shoulders, triceps again. Saturday is going to be a repeat of Tuesday, back, biceps, abs. Sunday, you're hitting legs again. So this allows you to spread volume throughout the week and train each muscle group twice a week. Another split routine example, this allows for training each muscle group twice a week again, but maybe you're more restricted on time. You can only get to the gym 4 days a week. You would rest here, or if you're newer to training, I wouldn't do the 6-day split that I just previously talked about. If you're a novice, that's a lot of days of training if you're not used to it. This is a more feasible and realistic split for you to do if you're a newbie and you're new to training. So you come in on Monday, this is just upper body muscles. So do some chest exercises, maybe pick a couple, back, then shoulders, then biceps, then triceps. And I would do it in that order. I have it in a specific order for a reason. Chest, that's a pressing motion. Back is a pulling motion. Shoulders then is a pressing motion, right? Like think of shoulder presses overhead. Bicep is a pulling motion. And then triceps is a pressing. It's extending the elbow. So you can see how you're basically alternating push, pull, push, pull. So when your push muscles are active and you're training those, the muscles that pull are resting, okay, and vice versa. Tuesday, you can do lower body and abs. Wednesday, rest. Thursday is a repeat of Monday. Friday is a repeat of Tuesday. Now, because you are working more muscles each day on a 4-day split than a 6, you would need to cut your volume back a little bit on each one of those muscle groups. I mean, you're not going to do 15 sets of chest on Monday and 15 of back and 15 of shoulders and 15 of bicep. You're going to be in the gym all day if you're doing that. So you need to reduce the volume down so that you're not in the gym for 2 or 3 hours. And you're still going to be able to get an adequate amount of muscle growth. So maybe you do 5 sets of chest on Monday, another 5 sets of chest on Thursday, right? 5 sets of back Monday, 5 sets of back on Thursday. That way you're still hitting that minimum, that 10 sets per week that you need to really optimize muscle growth. So really, again, you need to hit that minimum of 10 sets per week. Again, you maybe do just 5 sets of chest Monday, 5 on Thursday. That way you accomplish that total weekly, or achieve that total weekly volume. All right, so this systematic review published in 2016 looked at the effects of resistance training frequency on measures of muscle hypertrophy. There's also a meta-analysis, so they ran statistics on multiple studies in this area to kind of determine the overall weight and come up with a conclusion here by looking at all these different studies. So underlined in red there, the conclusion, the current body of evidence indicates that frequencies of training twice a week promote superior hypertrophic outcomes compared to once a week. So superior muscle mass gains if you train each muscle group twice a week as compared to just once a week. It can therefore be inferred that the major muscle groups should be trained at least twice a week to maximize muscle growth. That's not to say you can't get muscle growth by training each muscle group once a week. You can. It's just going to be more optimal, and you're going to maximize your potential for muscle growth if you can train each of your major muscle groups twice per week, and you're getting at least, 10 to 30 sets of volume in for each muscle group spread out across the week, twice a week, okay? Other important points. Make sure you use a full range of motion when performing exercises. That's important. I mean, I'm not too big of a fan of half reps. So work a muscle through its full range. Work the target muscle through the entire concentric. That's the phase where the muscle is shortening. Like in a curl, your bicep, when you curl that load towards your upper arm, the biceps brachii is going to shorten. Then when you lower that load back to the ground, it's producing tension, but it's lengthening. That's the eccentric phase. It's helping to decelerate the load as you lower that dumbbell back to the floor. So work it through the whole range. Develop a strong mind-muscle connection. Okay, so it's important to, if you're really wanting to promote growth and muscle hypertrophy, focus on that muscle that's contracting when you're doing an exercise, right? Think about it. So for instance, the chest, I know the chest muscle attaches to my sternum and my clavicle, and it attaches out here to my upper arm. So if I'm benching, I might be thinking about what that muscle does. It literally pulls my upper arm in towards the midline, right? And so I can think about that muscle shortening and pulling my arm in towards my body. So again, that's a form of internal cueing, right? Internal cueing can be beneficial for hypertrophy, focusing on the contraction of that muscle. Now, there are studies showing that external cueing is more beneficial if you're trying to improve maximal strength or athletic performance. So an example of external cueing would be like if I'm doing a deadlift or a squat, and instead of thinking about the muscles I'm using in that movement, because I'm using a really heavy load or I'm really training for strength, it's more important to think about external cues, like I'm going to drive the floor away from my feet. Or if I'm bench pressing a really heavy load, like I'm going to do a 1-rep max, it's probably more important to focus not so much on the muscle, but just being able to move that load and overcome the heavy load. So I might think about looking up at the ceiling. I find a point on the ceiling, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to explode this barbell off my chest and try to push it through the ceiling. So you're using external cues to drive your performance there. And that's kind of the difference in if you're thinking about lifting a heavy load, training for maximal strength versus maybe more moderate loads that you can really focus on a muscle and use more internal cueing. So what about repetition speed and duration? A wide range of repetition speeds, stumbling over my tongue. A wide range of repetition speeds and durations can be used if the main goal is to maximize muscle growth. Training at very slow durations, like 10 seconds per repetition, that's very slow, resisting a load down and then back up, that has been shown to be suboptimal for increasing muscle size, okay, using those extremely slow durations. Other than that, you can use a wide range of repetition speeds. I do think if you're wanting to develop optimal power, though, you really do need to focus on velocity, because force times velocity is power. So there's been some research done in our Jayhawk Athletic Performance Lab about the importance of bar speed and velocity that I talked about in another video. Supramaximal eccentric loading can be used occasionally, and that may actually help further enhance muscle hypertrophy and muscle growth. So this is where you load the, let's say, barbell, for instance, with a weight that's heavier than your 1 repetition max, and you need a partner to do this. So let's say you can bench, 225 pounds. You load the barbell with 240 pounds, and you lower it to your chest for 5 reps, and your partner helps pull it off your chest. You can always lower more in the eccentric phase than what you can lift and overcome. You can always lower a greater load than you can lift, but lowering loads that are heavier than what you can lift in the concentric phase off your chest, that can actually promote some muscle growth. And I think this is good to use if you're kind of plateaued in your training program. You can do some eccentric loading. You just have to have a partner to help you, because they're going to have to help get it off of your chest, in this case, the example of a bench press. So again, those are some things to think about. Use that eccentric loading occasionally. Thanks for watching. Hope that this episode provided you with some beneficial guidelines that you can use when you're doing your resistance training. Thanks for watching.